The one who truly has the gift of handing on the faith is the storyteller. I know in this age it's difficult for us to think in those terms because we're very much people who want to have very definable facts. But if we look at the life of the church, it began with the apostles sharing the stories of faith they had in their encounters with Jesus Christ. And it is those accounts that inspired people to place their faith in someone they had never met. And so when we look at this role of handing on the faith or sharing our faith with others, it really comes to the place of how we share the story of Jesus Christ. And the readings that we have for today so powerfully open up to our eyes the different realities that Jesus brought with him as he became incarnate and lived his mission, and through his passion and death on the cross, his resurrection, what it began, the work that began through all of this. If Diana was someone, she was a storyteller. She had a lot of stories. And any of us who spent a little time with her, we got to hear a lot of different kinds of stories. We could get stories about how her family escaped the Nazi oppression through Italy, and how she was kind of shuttled through a convent, and what impact that had on her future life. It's a very fascinating story. We can hear stories of how she began to work here in the Archdiocese, and how she was so excited to work for the Archdiocese, and all the different things that she had done, and when she started at she was full of all kinds of stories, and boy, she was like a master earbender, in that regard. But I think one of the stories that she told, not always with her words or her voice, was the story of her own faith, which I think many of us would say it was extremely evident as something that she spoke of every day of her life. Certainly being a part of this worshiping community and being here for daily Mass as often as it could be permitted for her, she found that a great joy to her day, that she could go to work and go to Mass in the same place. Oh my gosh! That was just a great joy and a blessing for her, as I know it is for many of us here. And today, the gospel that was chosen, I picked that gospel because it was sort of the center of her life, especially as I got to know her, the sense of really being in communion with Jesus, especially through the Eucharist. That daily communion, daily Mass was such an important part of her spirituality and her life. And it really speaks to us of that very core element of what we believe, that we believe that Jesus still makes his presence known to us, and he becomes present in our lives in such a way that we can receive him. And in the Eucharist that we celebrate, this is not just a symbolic or something that's sort of like an image of. We believe that we are in communion, in contact with Christ himself. And it opens up to us this reality, this new reality of hope, even in the midst of or in the face of difficulties. And I think many of us who knew Diana realized that she faced a lot of difficulties in her life and was facing them on a daily basis. And that first reading from Paul, if God is for us, who can be against us? I think that was just, that was little Diana, just like, who's going to be against me? God's for me. I'll make it through. And she had her little Jewish mother ways about, how she was kvetching about life, and, she was a little verklempt about stuff. But hey, her faith was solidly placed in Christ Jesus. And even though she would suffer many different things, and us as well, even though we may face many challenges and many difficulties, it truly comes down to this place of our faith and hope in Christ. And in those words, those beautiful words from our gospel today, here, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him. This sense of remaining with Jesus, of staying with Jesus, is a very powerful theme that runs through all of John's account. And it was the sense that Jesus is pitching his tent with us. He's on the journey with us. And that is a very real and a very close and a very joyful presence. And even in the midst of toil and suffering and difficulty, there is a joy that Jesus communicates to our heart that no kind of difficulty or pain can overcome. How are we going to tell that story? How are we going to share that story of how Jesus Christ communicates this joy that is beyond all telling into our hearts, that he remains with us as we try and strive to remain with him? How are we going to communicate that story to a world that doesn't know how to receive it always? C.S. Lewis would say from his book, Grief Observed, you don't know what you really believe until its belief becomes a matter of life or death for you. And for Diana, this was at the core of her life. It was a matter of life and death for her. And in her death, she proclaims that message of hope in Christ. How are we going to continue that story? How are we going to share that message of hope, the message of joy that our colleague and our friend and our sister shared so often? How will we do it, church?